think this is a good point to get started. Hey, good morning or good afternoon or good evening to everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. My name is Frank Chistolke. I'm your VP of Innovation, and I have the pleasure of leading the Medical Alley Starts initiative, our effort to support the startup innovation ecosystem globally through the Medical Alley community. This is the first AMA Ask Me Anything webinar of the year, our ongoing series to bring some of the interesting people and organizations that make up the startup ecosystem to your room to share their perspectives, share their knowledge, and answer some of your questions. And as we're going through this, so I've got some starter questions, but you may notice down at the bottom of the screen, there's a thing that says Q&A. If you have questions as we're going through this, just type them in there. I'll be monitoring it. I've got it on my other screen, and I'll pull those questions into the conversation throughout. And then also after the event, if you're wanting to get in touch with one of our sponsors or get in touch with Black Opal Ventures, you can reach out to me or anyone on the Medical Alley staff, and we'll help get you plugged in. Before we get started, though, I want to give a shout out to our sponsoring organizations. We have an incredible group of companies who have stepped up to contribute their time and their treasure to help make Medical Alley Starts possible. I think many of you know Medical Alley is a nonprofit organization. We depend on your support to make this mission work, and our sponsor organizations have contributed mightily to that end. Wonderful people, wonderful organizations. I want to give a special shout out to JP Morgan and to Mike Giedel and his team. They couldn't join us today, but we'll have them on the next one. And then we've got a video for our other four incredible sponsor organizations where they're going to tell you a little bit of their story. And what I'll ask of you is if you need help, if your company needs services, these are the organizations you should start with. Support the businesses that support your business. And Tyler, if you want to run that video, please.
Hi, my name is Paul Carlson, and I'm a principal at CLA. CLA is a professional services firm that provides industry-focused outsourcing, audit, tax, wealth advisory, consulting, and digital services to healthcare and life science companies, including startups. We pride ourselves in working closely with entrepreneurs and business owners to help preserve capital, manage and mitigate financial risk, and achieve the future they envision. If you'd like to learn more about CLA, you can visit claconnect.com or contact me after the event. Medical Alley would also be glad to connect you, or you can find me on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Perfect. Hi, my name is Morgan Evans, and I am the founder of Avio MedTech Consulting. We provide fractional services in the areas of quality, regulatory, and engineering to medtech startups. If you would like to learn more about Avio, we ask that you visit our website at www.aviomedtech.com or contact me after the event. Medical Alley would also be happy to put you in touch with us, or you can reach out on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Ryan Johnson, and I'm a corporate healthcare attorney and shareholder at Frederickson and Byron. Frederickson is a full-service law firm based in Minneapolis with offices across the Midwest and in China and Mexico. We serve as legal counselors, business advisors, and strategic partners for many innovative life science and healthcare companies, ranging in size from the smallest startups, sometimes just a founder with an idea, to some of the world's largest medtech and healthcare organizations. If you'd like to find out more about Frederickson, you can visit fredlaw.com or contact me after the webinar.
My name is Christian Corello, and I'm the head of strategic growth for Mobius Medical. We are an Australia-based contract research organization now with U.S. operations and headquarters in Minneapolis. Mobius Medical is not your typical CRO, and that's by design. In addition to world-class first-in-human and early-stage medical device clinical trials, we are our client's strategic business partner too. We offer direct access to a full suite of subject matter experts ranging from regulatory and commercialization guidance to business strategy and capital raise advice. And every one of our services are designed specifically for medical device startup and scale-up companies, just like you. If you'd like to find out more about Mobius Medical's unique CRO services, please contact me after the event or find me on LinkedIn. Additionally, our mutual friends at Medical Alley can always connect us. Thank you.
Huge appreciation to all our sponsor organizations. Special recognition to Christian and the Mobius team, our newest sponsor, and the organization that when they come and visit always has the longest distance to go but are so deeply connected to this community and healthcare communities worldwide. And so with that, we'll get started with the conversation. I'll remind you again, folks, throw questions into the Q&A at any point. I've got it up here. I'll pull them in. I've got some starter questions because knowing there's a handful of good Minnesotans on the call, you probably don't want to go first. So we'll make it easy. So Tara, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate you taking some time.
Thanks so much, Frank. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I do want to thank Medical Alley for the opportunity to be here, and all the sponsors for enabling the opportunity for me to share a little bit about my career path and my thoughts on the startup ecosystem.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. And maybe that's the place to start. Could you give the audience a little bit of your background and then introduce Black Opal Ventures?
Absolutely. So a little bit about myself. I'm a physician with what I say a very wavy career path. I started out going to medical school right after undergrad in the late 1990s, went into residency right after that, and had a relatively I would say, traditional career path of going into residency right after medical school. But this was the early 2000s. And for anyone who has been in medicine or healthcare for a long time, you probably kind of remember the days of what the early 2000s were in healthcare. And as a resident in New York City, I remember sort of thinking, healthcare is really broken. And as much as I could become a general internist or specialize, I really wanted to have a career that would impact healthcare in a positive way. And that's taken me on an amazing journey and path through healthcare. So I finished my residency and then did a fellowship. As many people who may be doctors know, there's sort of a lot of training that goes into medicine. And then joined the faculty at Cornell Medical School and was a full-time faculty member for the first portion of my career. My work as a faculty member spanned from health policy to delivery of care. I was a practicing internist in the primary care practice. I did inpatient medicine. I did teaching services. And I did a lot of research, a body of research around how could we actually improve healthcare delivery, both by improving quality of care and reducing cost of care, with a particular focus on outpatient medicine and mental health care. That was an amazing experience to be sort of embedded in a large healthcare academic medical center. But I also had sort of an itch to try and move away from the research world and more into the operations world, and had an opportunity to join McKinsey, which is a global consulting company, in their healthcare practice. And I was hired as the first medical director in their healthcare practice, very much with a focus on what was going on with value-based care. At the time, this was 2015, 2016, the Affordable Care Act had been passed probably 5 years ago, but a lot of organizations were trying to figure out how to succeed in a value-based care environment. And the consulting company I was at was spending a lot of time both with payers and providers and government agencies to really help those organizations become successful participants and players in the value-based care environment. Amazing experience, and really, I would say my exposure to both the business side of healthcare and the private sector. I often say to colleagues that have been in medical centers all of their careers that I didn't realize how much more there was to healthcare than, and that was after being in healthcare for 15 years. It was a really eye-opening experience for me. Loved the work I was doing, but also then had an opportunity a few years later to join a Medical Alley startup called Bind in 2018, when we were very, very early on in the company. And I joined that company as their first chief clinical officer. when we had, a few dozen folks around the table building a really new insurance product that was driving value through a new underwriting model. That took me on a journey into the startup world, and happy to talk a little bit about the startup world a little later. But I really cherish that opportunity of being at an early phase startup and seeing that startup go from very early days to much more mature days. In 2021, I left Bind and started working on Black Opal Ventures, and we launched Black Opal Ventures in February of 2022. The focus of Black Opal Ventures is early phase investing in health tech startups, so seed to Series B companies. And our thesis is really around the value and the opportunity of bringing together highly innovative technology into healthcare. Healthcare is one of those industries that still uses fax machines. I remember the days of, trying to read. We've come a long way of the days of trying to read people's handwritings and paper charts, but we still have a long way to go. And it's, as many of you know, it is one of the most important and largest industries, both in the US and globally. So we invest in, again, these companies that are at the collision of healthcare and technology. Part of this thesis actually comes from where my co-founder and I met and the career paths that we had. So my co-founder, Eileen Tenghall, and I went to undergrad together over 30 years ago. And we were both engineers, took different career paths, have now found that there's quite a bit of opportunity for us to bring those career paths together. Eileen spent 20 years as a deep tech venture capital investor, both in the UK and in the US, and most recently was a managing partner at a fund called InQtel. InQtel, if you're not familiar with it, is the investing partner of the intelligence community and invests in really innovative technology that supports the mission of the intelligence communities. And what we were actually finding in about 5 years ago, in 2018, 2019, was that a lot of the technology around accessing data and utilizing data and then presenting that actually in the form that someone like an agent or a physician could use was actually happening in both of our sectors. And almost for the first time, we were seeing this collision of our two sectors and this opportunity to try and find companies that could bring together these two worlds. And that was really the impetus for the fund and the thesis around the fund. We started investing out of our own capital, and then we're fortunate to have some amazing backers, including Eli Lilly as our anchor investor, but a number of other banks and hospital systems as part of our investor group. And we focus on, as I said, seed to Series B companies that really are bringing together highly innovative technology coupled with go-to-market and value proposition in healthcare.
Oh, very interesting. I'm going to want to dig in a bit more in a minute on how being a clinician informs your perspective looking at the technology. But I was curious about something you mentioned when you went to McKinsey, the value-based care component. And I feel like we've talked about value-based care, either as value-based care with different terms for a long time. What's your perspective on the state of it today? Is it gaining traction? Is it having an impact? What are the barriers still to, that so-called transformation that I think we've long talked about?
Yeah, great question, Frank. Value-based care, I think there was, I think rightly so, a lot of optimism about the opportunity of value-based care to address a lot of the problems in healthcare. When you think about healthcare, we are looking for more accessible care, we're looking for higher quality care, and we need to manage cost of care. And value-based care in many ways has been able to do that. I think one of the challenges has been the expansion of value-based care beyond sort of a small percentage of the ecosystem. But I personally am, I do think that we are going to continue to see more value-based care. We're seeing models that are actually working, that are demonstrating that you can lower cost of care while maintaining high quality of care. I think an ecosystem, particularly on the provider side, that has an appetite for it. In fact, I think moving from a fee-for-service based system is a challenge, and perhaps it didn't go at the pace that we thought. We are not in 100% value-based care environment. Those numbers are closer to 20 to 30%. Yet I think that the future is going to have more and more focus on value, and that's where we're going to see a lot of innovation. One of the challenges, and I'll take an example of actually some of the work that we did when I was in consulting, is actually trying to build a way to actually pay for value. And that when you pay for value, you're not paying for all the individual things that get billed by a physician or a hospital. You're paying for sort of either a bundle of services or holistic care, and understanding how you even pay for that, and then also how you measure quality and safety around that, is a big challenge. And we needed to use lots of data. We needed to develop systems that had a lot of transparency. And even, a decade ago, we didn't have the capabilities, both from a data perspective and an infrastructure perspective, to be able to do so. So I think that idea that technology and innovation are going to continue to drive and power value-based care is really critical. And again, that's where we see a lot of the startup ecosystem playing a role.
That comment there, I find that very interesting. I think I heard you say we didn't have some of the foundational pieces in place to enable, say, new technologies or new business models that maybe now are there, or are there in enough of healthcare for those businesses to be viable. I think then about the other side of that, the technology piece, and I'm curious, your experience as a clinician, both as a researcher and as a practicing doctor, how does that inform the way you look at some of the technologies that are coming in? I always think of the classic of let's put tech in healthcare, get rid of the fax machine. And yet the fax machine, all these decades later, still sells. Is there something missing that maybe that clinical side helps inform?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge to adoption, I think it's severalfold. One of them is the practicality of it, right? I think about when I started training, we had paper charts. I'm sure anyone who is a clinician remembers these racks of paper charts that would sit in hospital wards. Or if you were seeing a patient, you would go to the file room and you'd get a paper chart. Now, electronic health records are now ubiquitous in healthcare. But if you actually look back sort of historically at what changed in healthcare, it was actually policy that changed us from using paper and pen and paper to digitization of healthcare. It was the Recovery Act of 2008 that really incentivized hospitals and doctors' offices to make that change. And the reason I bring that up is that healthcare is a hard industry to change. I think we are often set in our ways, but we also, change takes time, it takes resources, and from an organizational perspective, that can be a real barrier to change. What's interesting is now you sort of see how I look back and I think, oh my goodness, I used to spend hours of my day trying to find a chart or trying to read something. And I think about how much easier it is to use an electronic health record to be able to access information about a patient, at the tip of my fingers, just by typing into an electronic health record. And I think it's a good example of both the barriers, but then the opportunity of what we could potentially see. So coming from, putting on my clinician hat of having, worked with patients in front of me, having had, seen the transition of and the digitization of healthcare, I think understanding really what that end user is experiencing is really critical. And if you can make it easy and have it work in the flow of whatever is happening in a practice or in a payer's flow of operations, that's how you really get the end user to adopt. I think on the higher level, though, I think many of us, particularly in the startup ecosystem, understand that your go-to-market or the customer is often not that end user. It's not the clinician who is typing into a record or utilizing some new technology, but it's usually the organization level. And I often tell founders and others that you have to really understand sort of the value proposition that you're demonstrating for that organization, whether it is an ability for that organization to meet regulatory requirements or an ability for that organization to generate more revenue or to lower costs. You have to really understand that to understand how you get into that ecosystem and have adoption.
And something you said at the beginning of that I find very hopeful about the time savings that have come up. It's a good reminder that as many challenges as there are today in healthcare, that there has been some progress, some things that are better. And yeah, the charting piece of it sounds like a huge one. I think from the patient side, I go to two different health systems for different things. And as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, that was a nightmare to move records back and forth. Now, my doc at one has the records before I walk out of the office for my doc at the other. And it's integrated in the notes. It looks like one medical record. So yeah, it's a good reminder that there has been some progress, a lot more work to do. I think also a good reminder of the role of policy and how important it is to drive policy change to get some of the business changes we want. And a question that's coming in from the audience, I think kind of relates to that end to what you just said at the end about knowing the value proposition. Sean is asking, as a VC, would you be more interested in a company? And this is a false dichotomy, but go with it for a moment. That was trying to innovate in value-based care, or one who was reducing inefficiencies in a current fee-for-service model?
So I think both are very interesting for us. As I said, I am bullish on value-based care, but in the next, 5-10 years, when a company, I would even say shorter, right? 1 to 5 years when a company really has that are based on fee for service. And if there's ways to actually improve efficiency in fee for service in the short term, potentially even to have that move into the long term, right? More long term into value-based care. I think those are models that are interesting to us. I do think that I think what we are actually finding often in the value-based care arena is that companies are actually building off the ground some sort of value-based care model, because sometimes it's actually hard to have a very fee-for-service model change into, it just takes time and it takes resources to transform a model into value-based care. And so the concept of actually starting out with like a value-based care delivery model and really thinking about how you build that from scratch is something that we often see. But we also often see companies that say, we actually, we can deliver, for example, I'll use examples of digital healthcare companies. We can deliver an amazing virtual care model. Maybe we start with fee for service because we can actually start to generate revenue. We can start to prove out our model, but over time, we're going to be able to take more risks. So we see both models happening, some that go out and say, this is all going to be value-based. We're going to build it end to end. And we're going to derive that value from the get-go, and others that really say, we do have the contracts are already fee for service. Maybe we start with that and then over time move into value-based models.
Well, I suspect, no conversation of whether value-based care or fee for service would be complete without then also asking about the payer side of the equation. You had experience in that and working in Bind and creating a very different underwriting model, eventually acquired by our friends at United Health Group. How does the payer world fit into the transition to value-based care, and how do you think about either the types of startups or the sort of policies, the things we need to do to move them along in the journey as well?
Yeah, so the payers obviously, and that was, just to give a little bit of sort of my experience at Bind, that was where, part of the thing that I noticed and realized when I moved out of the health system ecosystem into consulting and then into Bind was actually how much importance the payer has in this ecosystem. If you actually look at things that really drive change, paying for healthcare differently is a big driver of change. And if you look at value-based care models, they didn't, it wasn't necessarily health systems that were driving the change. It was the payer saying, we're going to pay in a different way. In, say, a bundled way or in a global payment way, and that drove change on the health system side. So the power of a payer is incredibly important. What has been interesting, sort of going back, well over a decade into like when value-based care really started, and the role that payers played. What's been interesting to me has been actually the role that public payers have really played in the value-based care environment. I, for example, worked with a number of state Medicaid programs that, because of the Affordable Care Act, actually had state innovation grants that allowed them to innovate and really drive value-based care models. And so what's fascinating is actually, we don't typically think of public or government-sponsored programs to be the most innovative, but there were so many incentives right after the Affordable Care Act to really innovate in that space that they became really the drivers of innovation in value-based care, almost more so than the private commercial kind of payers. And again, lot driven by policy. The role that the payer does play is I can't underestimate how important that is for driving change.
Yeah, that is really interesting on the public payers side. And I think, those of you in the audience or who are in the device industry, I think appreciate that as well, where often Medicare in particular drives a lot of the new payment policy that then the commercial payers are adopting. It's interesting to hear that a similar sort of thing may be happening on the health service or the digital health side or new care delivery models. Kind of building on that a bit more. So when you joined Vind, you were in this small startup that was going to eventually experience hyper growth. How is that experience, like having been on that side of the table, then now inform the way you look at investing and the investment thesis that you and your partner developed?
Yeah, great question. I think people get into venture capital through many different ways, right? Some people might join venture capital early in their careers, perhaps after business school or after having spent time on different types of investing. I came from an operating world and having multiple experiences working in multiple areas of the ecosystem of healthcare. I do think my experience at Bind is perhaps one of my most valuable experiences as a venture capitalist. Mostly, I think, to actually be able to support our portfolio companies. I think the experience of being a doctor, having worked in the policy world, having come from consulting, all of those actually, I think, help support our ability to invest in this space, understand the ecosystem in real depth, and understand where we think there are opportunities to invest. But the support of a portfolio company is a really critical role of a venture capitalist. Once you invest in a company, it becomes you become part of that company in many ways. Maybe you sit on a board, maybe you really are advising a founder very closely. They go through ups and downs, and I remember many of those ups and down days of being at an early phase company. I joined a company where we didn't have revenue, we didn't have customers at the time. Everyone was doing everything. We would roll up our sleeves, we try to standardize things, but a lot was getting built very quickly. And we went through a phase where you build very quickly. I remember the first time we had open enrollment, and we would get questions, and we'd think, "Oh my gosh, no one ever thought of that question." I'm going to answer it. Go write it down. And that's sort of that is the early phase company. And we ended up, as you said, growing very rapidly. But you have to then think about how you scale and how you actually how you organize differently so that everyone isn't doing everything. So I think all of those experiences of working in the ups and downs of a healthcare startup is really valuable for being able to be a good partner with our founders and our portfolio companies to really leverage some of the experiences of what it was like, the challenges that we face, but also how you think about growing companies and scaling.
Yeah, right on. The empathy piece there sounds very significant, and I appreciate you highlighting like the questions no one had thought of before. It seems each startup is sort of an original creation, even if there are other companies doing similar things, and that experience is kind of singular, no matter how many times it's done. If I turn it around, and so now sitting in the VC seat, you meet lots of interesting companies, maybe a few that are less interesting. You get lots of pitches. One of the things we get asked about a lot from our startup members is they're always wondering, like, they want the tips and tricks and all of that fun. I'm always interested in what things go wrong. When you're hearing a pitch or when you're in diligence or you're looking at a potential investment, are there things that jump out to you as far as like, okay, these seem to be common red flags or mistakes or challenges that emerge that maybe aren't as obvious to the entrepreneur, but are seen from that perspective on the VC side?
Yeah, great question, Frank. And happy to share some perspectives. I think one thing, just to sort of set the stage so that founders know what we are seeing as VCs, we see thousands of pitches. The percentage, we actually were looking at some of our data since we started the fund, we've seen probably 2,000 pitches, and we have 9 portfolio companies, right? So the likelihood and the odds are very small. Now, every fund has different theses. We all look for different things. We have personally a rubric that we use when we assess a company. And I think for a founder to understand what really is driving that venture capital fund to invest is really important. You can ask them, right? It may be something that would be on a website, maybe not. But what are the key things that you're looking for? Might be a valuable thing to ask a venture capitalist if you're on the phone or on a Zoom with them. And I said every venture capital firm has different theses, different criteria for investing. But I do want to point out and highlight just the volume of investments that we see, and the challenges that we have in sort of being able to filter down into those key companies. In those initial pitches, I think spending time really, one of the things that we really spend a lot of time in is go to market and how you're actually going to monetize what you're doing. That is one of the things sometimes in very early phase companies that have not gone to market that I see. I see it sometimes not thought through well enough of who are you going to sell to? What's your business model? And thinking about sort of the future revenue that you're having. What does that actually look like? We love to see that kind of thing because, in fact, if a successful startup has to be able to generate revenue, they have to ideally become profitable. They have to sell into what is a very difficult market to sell into, and if that hasn't been thought out thoughtfully, that can be a real challenge for us. The other thing is just there's something about, founders and founding teams. I think many venture capitalists do like to see people who have some experience, either as a founder or as an executive in a successful startup. Largely because of what I mentioned, there's a lot of ups and downs that happen, and there's a lot to navigate. And so, having some of that experience is something that we value quite a bit, because we know that that's something, founders who sort of know how to do this can navigate those things a little bit easier than others. But we also see great founders that come from other areas that really have there's something very unique and special about that founder that makes us want to back them. And then I would say the other thing is just I think the red flags for us is a lack of transparency. If a founder or a CEO is not going to be transparent about things, or we find out things in diligence that were not disclosed to us, those become big red flags. If it seems like the founder is not going to be communicative and a partner with us, that's another area that might be a red flag for us. And again, if the founder hasn't really thought about how they get to revenue, how they get to profitability, what they think an exit might be like, those are all things that you really should be thinking about from the day one of starting your company. Understanding how other companies exit in your space are all really important things for you to think about. We sometimes see founders that talk a lot about the tech or the model they have and spend, an entire meeting talking about that. And, we do want to know, how are you going to generate revenue? What does that actually look like? And what's your forward thinking about the company?
Yeah, indeed. The go-to-market piece, it seems obvious on face. We're talking about business, but it does seem to be, especially at earlier stages, maybe missing too often. And I will highlight for the attendees the numbers that were shared. We hear that from other venture funds as well, that somewhere between 300 to 600 companies per check written seems to be pretty consistent among most venture funds, which if I think about that as an entrepreneur, that makes me think, okay, I'm going to need to not only have my stuff together, but have potentially different ways of financing the company if I'm committed to having it be a success.
That's right.
If I flip it around, I think about the last couple of years, well, let's say the last 5 years have been wild, which is an understatement, of course. In the venture world, we saw this huge rush of investment, valuations climb up. 2023 might have been the reversal of that, or the reversion to mean in some way. What's your take on the state of venture capital today, of healthcare investing? This is going to vary for everyone, but what's your take on the market today?
Yeah, I mean, Frank, you really hit the nail on the head. It's been a roller coaster. We did not start deploying capital until 2022. And in many ways, I'm very grateful we missed the hype of 2020, 2021. I was at Bind at that time, and it's fascinating to kind of see the number of companies that sort of cropped up in the digital healthcare space. And I do think that rightly so, there was a real transformation in healthcare from in-person care to more telemedicine and virtual care that happened because of COVID, but maybe a level of overexuberance in the potential for that kind of care to completely transform healthcare, and an overexuberance in the potential exit in that space. You know, we saw a number of companies SPAC in 2021. I think there was an expectation that you can start a company, you can SPAC at a crazy valuation. And then we saw the public markets respond to that and say, that's not, you're not going to get this valuation from the public markets. And so, and I will say, we were working on establishing our fund in 2021. There was a little bit of I don't know if it's FOMO or what, but, that we were missing out on these hot deals that were happening in 2021. I am grateful that we were actually able to take, invest in a time when things were a little bit calmer, and we could take time with companies. We could take time to build our theses and not have to kind of rush into these hot deals of the 2021 vintage. What we are seeing now is, I do think companies are, there's a few things that we're seeing now. So it's definitely a different time than 2021. And companies are, I think there's an expectation that you have to be able to show that you have revenue and revenue growth, good product market fit, and that you're differentiated from the competitors. I think those are sort of table stakes that are happening right now. I think about, I'll use digital healthcare and telemedicine as an example. We were seeing dozens and dozens of solutions for maternity care, for mental health care, for any condition that you could think of. I think we're going to start to see either some consolidation or winners or losers in that space. And so if you're going out sort of fresh into a new company, you have to think about how you're going to differentiate from all the others that are out there, particularly in that space. The other is we are starting to see valuations changing. I think this is probably the time period where companies are going back to market. They may have had bridge rounds, they may have had insider rounds, but as they go back to market, the market is reevaluating valuations. And I think 2024 is going to be one of those years. It's about 3 to 4 years after perhaps previous funding rounds. And as much as bridge rounds are a possibility, they aren't a permanent solution. And so we are starting to see valuations changing. And I think for founders, you have to think about, how much of a valuation change are you willing to take if you are in that kind of situation? How much of the company would you be willing to sell through equity to venture capital? All important questions, but it's certainly something that we are seeing on the venture capital side. And then I would also say the last thing is a real focus on a path to profitability. This was something that I think in 2020 and 2021, I actually remember the days of the dot-com boom and bust in 2000 and 2001, where no one talked about profitability. It was a matter of just increasing revenue and getting capital in round after round to be able to support that not just the growth in revenue, but the growth in expenses that went alongside that. And I think the last 2 to 3 years, what we're seeing is really a focus on helping companies think about profitability, not just revenue growth. And I think that's an important question to ask if you're a founder, to ask yourself, what is your path to profitability? Because it's going to get harder and harder to raise rounds and possibly valuations that are not the kind of valuation that we saw in a few years ago.
Yeah, indeed. We're seeing that in some of our companies already. And I'll say attendees, if you're going through those sorts of things, reach out. There are other entrepreneurs who have recently had to go through some of those challenges, step down on valuations, make some pretty tough changes to manage through the environment today compared to what it was a few years ago. I can remember the dot-com times, and it wasn't even revenue in some cases. It was eyeballs was a metric, which hindsight, right, crazy and wacky. We might have had a little bit of that again the last couple of years, now a bit more normal times. One other question was coming in, a very practical one, and one we hear a lot that I think has a relatively simple answer, but there certainly is some variability in it, which is just people are asking, well, if you don't have that direct connection, how do you go about getting connected, getting a meeting with a VC? And in particular, they're asking a secondary one of, if you see over 1,000 pitches at a time, how are you sorting through that mass to get to, the handful that you're to spend deeper time with to see if it's worthwhile for an investment?
Yeah, great question. So I guess the first part of that question, how do you get in front of VCs? If you're very early phase, I think there are opportunities to get in front of investors. They may not be venture capital investors. They may be more like angel groups or individuals who could write some of those smaller checks very early on. Those, there are angel group pitches, there are pitch competitions that happen kind of all over the place. We see a lot that come in through pitch competitions and through accelerator programs that enable you to kind of get into an ecosystem that can get your pitch out there. So I think for early phase in companies, those are good opportunities to try and get your pitch out there. The second is, we share a lot of deals. I mean, if you have an investor in your company, whether it's an angel investor or a venture capitalist, ask them to introduce you. That is probably the place that we get most of our deals, is actually through deal flow from other investors. I would say the majority of our deals come from other investors, and those, we take those seriously, right? It means that someone else has vetted the company, and we and there is some validity to the company. And then, I think in general, sort of your network and ecosystem, if you can leverage your network to find people who might have connections to venture capital, that's another just general way. But I will say leveraging your investors is a great way to do so. I would say the other area is just sort of high profile things. We do look at for example, companies that are winning awards at different, in different industry areas. So for example, in New York City, there's a set of awards that are given out every year in the digital healthcare arena. We will look at those lists because we know the people who are running those lists and selecting those companies. And so those are other ways that we source deals. It's just, we will do market research and industry research in order to source deals and then reach out. So if you are able to get into some of those higher profile awards and lists, those are ways that I think we will source deals from a proactive perspective. The second question that you asked about, how do you sift through this number of deals? So I will say we don't take 1,000 meetings a year. I don't think we would physically have the ability to do so, but we do look to source those deals. Either research, we do a lot of research on PitchBook. If people are not familiar with that, it is a database that we use to understand both the valuation of companies, what their financing has been, and other aspects of the company. We will review pitch decks offline and can make a decision about whether something's interesting or not without necessarily having a meeting. So we don't physically do that, thousands and thousands of meetings, but we do sift through a number of potential companies to get to that first meeting and then to do follow-ons. And we try to, and again, every venture capital firm uses their own metrics for how they move someone through a funnel. We have a set of criteria that we look for that includes the market opportunity, the leadership, how much whether they are generating revenue and how much revenue that is, the relative competition in the field, the technology that they're developing, and the potential exit opportunities and valuations of those exits compared with the valuation of the company now. So, those are all things that we look at. We have a quantitative way of measuring each of those and doing analyses around that. And so from a sort of how do you move from just the pitch to the next area? We will be doing those sort of mental math when we're even just evaluating a company in a first meeting to understand whether they will even kind of pass the rubric that we have in order to move to the next phase. The next phases are typically, quite a bit of diligence. Next phases are deep diligence into data rooms, into references, into us doing financial analyses. But that first step of how do you go from a first meeting to the next, we're thinking about all of those factors in that first meeting so that we can quickly say it's going to meet the criteria or it's not.
What I'm hearing you describe reminds me a lot of a sales process. If the VC is the customer, of building awareness and credibility, of networking to make connections, and then knowing the customer, right? Knowing the kinds of things you want to invest in, what the fund cares about, and then being very targeted. Um, yeah, like that is a process that it reminds me a lot of sales, and something that, for the audience, I think many of you understand, because many of you have been in commercial roles, just now applied in a different realm. I want to ask, on the other end, then, the exit side. So you talked a little bit about the kind of the venture capital market. How does the exit side of things look for you right now? Or how are you thinking about that? Historically, we think of M&A and IPOs as like the most common realm. Haven't seen a ton of IPOs, for which makes sense given the market. How do you think about the exits for your companies?
Yeah, you explained it quite nicely, Frank. So, when we think about exits for companies, and again, I think it's important for early phase founders to think about what that exit is. If you're a venture capitalist, we have typically a 10-year cycle of our fund. And so we are looking to have exits within that 10-year cycle, ideally sooner if it's a later phase company. We understand earlier phase companies may need those 7 to 10 years in order to exit. But if you're a revenue generating Series B company, we ideally would like to know that there's an exit potential in a shorter time period. From an exit potential, and again, we do mostly health tech investing. That includes all the way from delivery of care to diagnostics to things that are supporting drug discovery and development. We also have part of our portfolio is companies that are broader than healthcare, that may be building the infrastructure layer for data and analytics and AI. I think particularly on the health tech focused area, the vast majority of companies will exit in acquisition. IPO is a more rare phenomenon. The majority of companies will exit in M&A. And if you think about it's often thinking about who are your key customers that would find value in your product. If you are a device developer, there's a natural set of potential acquirers for a device kind of company. If you are a drug discovery platform, there's a set of life sciences companies that are potential acquirers of that technology. I will say it's been interesting to kind of see what's happening in the digital healthcare delivery side of things. Because we don't typically see health systems being massive acquirers of digital healthcare solutions. We have seen things happen more perhaps on the payer side, where there is a mix of payer provider services happening. And then we did see a level of excitement that happened in 2021 from the public, the IPO market. We're still trying to figure out what is going to be the long-term exit strategy, particularly for digital healthcare companies. But I do think from the most likely scenarios, if a successful exit does happen, is in the M&A world. I think we will start to see some opening of the IPO world. I think in the next few years, as you said, Frank, it's been a little bit frozen at the moment. And I think it's just a vestige of challenging IPOs that happened perhaps too quickly for companies in 2021, and the public market's not really responding favorably to those IPOs.
Yeah, indeed. And something you said, I think for the audience, super important, that digital health in some ways as a business is new enough that we're still figuring out those exits. And that as an entrepreneur, that is a really important thing to understand. And I think to build into your work, to really think, like, you got to know exit period. But in this market where it is a little bit newer, unlike say in device, if I'm doing a heart valve, I know who I'm calling up, right? Very relatively straightforward. That is an extra layer of challenge. A couple of just practical questions that have come in, and then we'll come to the last question for the day. So we got a person asking, what's like your sweet spot as far as average check size? And then is there a minimum on the revenue side for what you all look at as far as like, say, a seed investment?
Yeah, great questions. And again, for us in particular, we invest in as small as checks that are 100K to excuse me, to our largest check size is about 2 million in an investment, and it's based on sort of maturity of the company. So if a company is, a PowerPoint deck, but there's something really compelling about the technology or the team, or the market opportunity, we will write a smaller check to try and get to know that team and that founder and that company well, so that we can hopefully participate in later rounds. That's part of what we call our Scout program. So that is a Black Opal Ventures Scout program that really looks for early phase, highly promising companies, or companies that actually, as I mentioned earlier, we have companies that are broader than healthcare. These may be companies that have a technology that we see potential promise in healthcare, but their revenue is coming from a different area, and healthcare may just be an early thing that they're thinking about. So that's our Scout program. Our other, in more mature companies, Series A to Series B, it's typically $1 to $2 million checks. Now we are a smaller fund, and so with that check size, particularly with what typical A and B rounds are, we're typically not a lead investor in those rounds. But it totally depends on how big a round that is. But we'd love to be a value add syndicate partner with a lead investor. And in terms of revenue, it depends on the company. As I said, for our Scout program, there may be no revenue, but there's something highly promising about the company. I think there are sort of revenue benchmarks that we look at for different phases of companies, and that may vary by subsector. I think things that require more regulatory approval may require more capital early on before they can generate revenue. We understand that. Whereas a company that's more of a tech-enabled services model might be able to generate revenue relatively early on in their life cycle.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. I think that's a great place to wrap it up. And I'll say thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Frank. And wonderful to be here alongside Medical Alley.
And folks, we had a bunch of other great questions that we couldn't get in. If you email me after this, we'll be sure to try to work those in, follow up with you, or connect other people who may be able to help. And if you want to get in touch with any of the sponsors, track us down. We'll help you plug in. We'll have the next one up on the web pretty quick here. So until next time, thank you for being a part of the Medical Alley community, and have a great day.